And thank you very much to the National Trust for inviting me to address you today. And thanks particularly to the Trust for putting on this forum, which is looking at some most critical issues for the future of Adelaide, the city in particular, the metropolitan area in particular. And thanks to Norman for your presentation, which has provided a bit of a background and segue into my presentation on climate change. Deborah mentioned the work of the Working Group on Land Use Planning and Climate Change in South Australia, and I will briefly mention that we established about a year and a half ago. We comprise retired, semi-retired lawyers and planners who share a common concern about whether or not our new statutory land use system, our new legislation, adequately addresses the pressing issue of climate change. And not wishing to string out my conclusion, the answer is it does so quite inadequately. So what I'd like to do today is to, firstly, as I said or mentioned, reflecting the work of the working group, I wish to identify the capacity of the new system to address climate change, and then to consider where climate change factors will sit in painting a vision for our city. And in passing, I might say I can endorse Norman's remarks. In terms of vision in our planning system, regulatory and otherwise, it's pretty thin on the ground. We lack visionaries, and visionaries are what we need at this point in time. Let's give some kind of context here. The climate change prognosis, we can look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of 2021. And it stated that was released in August. And the IPCC stated that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. Unequivocal. Perhaps up to a few years ago, climate sceptics derived some satisfaction from the fact that the IPCC was not as clear and adamant in its prognosis. Now it's unequivocal. The IPCC in its report goes on to say that global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, the two critical thresholds in terms of global warming, will be exceeded in this century unless we have deep cuts in carbon dioxide emissions in the coming decades. And you'll all be aware, of course, that we have an IPCC conference in Glasgow in a few days, and that will be attended by our Prime Minister, who appears to have scrambled together some reconfirmation of an obligation which I think already appeared in the Paris Agreement, that is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So for those of you who might be a bit sceptical about the IPCC and regard it as an unacceptably left-wing group, we can turn to the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO in Australia, who in 2020 described or summarised the implications for Australia, which include SA, that is the implications of climate change. Now that report in 2020 suggested that Australia's climate has already warmed by an average of 1.44 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.24. So in the worst case, we've already exceeded in Australia the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a critical threshold as far as the IPCC is concerned. And those records are over about 110 years. The organisations suggest the consequences are likely to be a marked increase in extreme fire weather. We're familiar with that over the last, the fires 2 years ago. The conditions, the fire weather conditions, bushfire intensity, as Norm mentioned, increased sea level rise, and a decline in rainfall across southeastern Australia. So we're going to be looking at more extreme heat events, longer droughts, longer fire seasons and sea level rise. As far as cities are concerned, of course, cities are responsible for significant contribution to carbon emissions through domestic and industrial energy consumption, transport systems. Roughly 28% of our carbon emissions come from fossil fuel motor vehicles in cities, including Adelaide. And of course, construction and development itself, the carbon that's used to produce materials by which we develop our city. So a planning goal there, a fundamental planning goal, must be the mitigation or minimisation of carbon emissions from cities, in our case the city, our metropolitan area. Now, in addition to the issue or the other side of the coin in terms of carbon emissions, the other side of the coin of mitigation is that of effective adaptation, and Norman mentioned that in his address. The kind of impacts we're looking at that we need to address in cities, including Adelaide, are increased and less predictable extreme heat events. I won't go through all of these. As Norm mentioned, sea level rise, increased water resources vulnerability, and health impacts. An extensively overheated urban environment carries very significant health implications, which by and large we are not taking into account at the moment, being preoccupied, of course, with another pressing health issue. And of course, in terms of dealing with these impacts, we're going to have increased protective and remedial infrastructure costs. It's going to cost us a lot of money to address these issues in any effective way. Now, before I move on to talk about the new planning system, I want to give attempt to give some kind of balance to ensure we have some kind of balanced approach here, because I'm going to be quite critical of the new planning system and government responsibility for that. However, it's not that we're doing nothing in South Australia about climate change issues. We could be doing very much more and should be doing, but things are being done slowly perhaps, very slowly, and perhaps in an untimely fashion. But nevertheless, we need to recognise we have a Climate Change and Greenhouse Emissions Reduction Act, and we've had it since 2007. We have a Premier's Climate Change Council, which interestingly is not administered by the Premier. It's administered by the Minister for Environment and Water. One can draw one's implications from that, one's conclusions. We have a 2020 to 2025 action plan on climate change released late last year. And I do, although it speaks more to what we are going to do or what governments are going to do in the future rather than what they've achieved already, I do commend it to you as some indication of what needs to be done at least in the immediate rather than foreseeable future. And we have climate change targets for 2030 of 50% below 2005 carbon emission levels, and for 2050 net zero emissions. And we've had those targets as government policy, and they exceed those in the 2007 Act. We've had those for the past 2 years. And I did note recently that the government is proposing to legislate those targets under the climate change legislation. I might say in passing that the states, in the absence of any significant leadership, or perhaps any leadership from the federal government, have taken the lead on climate change and have had to do so. There's been an immobility, a lack of movement on the part of the federal government, and the slack has, by default, been taken up to the extent that it has by the states. Now, one important factor we need to look at in terms of the context for tackling climate change in South Australia is that we are well ahead of the pack on the utilisation of renewable resources for electricity generation. We are at 61%, which is very high. Now, we've got good fortune of a lot of sun and a lot of wind and a lot of space. But nevertheless, it has taken worthwhile policies on the part of the government to actually achieve this 61%. It's projected to be 100% by 2030, and I've read figures of 500% by 2050, suggesting an export market for our energy, but it does raise a few issues about the infrastructure, the associated infrastructure costs if we're going to generate that much renewable electricity relying on renewable energy. Let's move on quickly to climate change and the role of land use planning. We know that it's land use that generates carbon, and land use is the basis of responding to carbon. So it follows that our land use systems are absolutely critical. Our statutory land use systems are absolutely critical to dealing with the issue of climate change in terms of both mitigation and adaptation. Now, this is a very simple schematic of our new planning system, and it's so simple and so basic that it reflects, probably generically at least, most statutory planning systems around the world, at least in industrialised and democratised societies. We have in South Australia now the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act, which was passed in 2016. It became fully operational, pretty much fully operational, in March this year, March the 19th, if my memory serves me correctly. Now, in terms of climate change, and this schematic is reflecting the climate change issue, or is intended to, we have under the Planning Act, as required by that Act, a state planning policy on climate change, SPP 5. I'm going to talk about that later. We have a regional planning system, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It's important and it is significant in terms of climate change, but the concept of the Planning and Design Code and how that addresses climate change is perhaps more significant and warrants attention in the limited time available. And we'll see that the Planning and Design Code, which is informed to a limited extent, as I'll point out later, by the state planning policy, the Planning and Design Code is the rule book on which development applications must be based. Any decisions by development assessment panels, relevant authorities, must be made with regard to that particular document and pretty much to the exclusion of everything else. So let's quickly look at the Act. Does the Act really address climate change in any significant sense? Well, there's an explicit reference to climate change under the principles of good planning under section 14, and those principles must be adhered to, complied with by relevant authorities, those making, various authorities administering the Act. So that's an obligation, and climate change is mentioned there. We have, as I mentioned, a state planning policy on climate change, which is required by section 62. It's an obligation on the government to produce a state planning policy on climate change. And we have an indirect reference in that an object of the Act is sustainability, which obviously, if you have a sustainable society, you have one which has effectively addressed the issue of climate change. But that's all we've got in the Act. That's all we have. So obviously a recommendation can be made, and has been made by the working group that I'm involved with, that climate change should have clear and specific recognition in the Act as a planning priority. It should be one of, if not the, primary driver of planning in this state. As I'll point out later, without that preoccupation with climate change under our planning system, we're likely to run into some very serious problems within the next 15, 20 years or so. Some of us may not be around to actually have to suffer from those consequences, but our kids and their kids will be dealing with those problems. Let's have a look at the state planning policy on climate change. Now, interestingly, as I said, there is a provision in the Act which says we must have, and we do have, therefore, a planning policy on climate change. However, it was an afterthought. The original bill for Planning Development Infrastructure Act did not have that requirement, and it was an amendment put forward by Mark Parnell in 2016 which resulted in that clause being introduced into the Act. Otherwise we wouldn't have it. That, I think, presents a message, provides a message. What was the priority, or what was the perceived priority of climate change when the government was formulating a new planning act 5 years ago? Very low. Now, admittedly, there have been significant changes in impacts and awareness over the last 5 years or so, but nevertheless, in 2016 we had a fairly good grasp of what climate change was about. The planning policy itself is 3 pages long and it lacks detail. The code, the Planning and Design Code, which I mentioned, the planning rules, must comply with what are called principles for statutory instruments. Now, you might say, well, are they likely to be extensive, helpful, detailed? 2 paragraphs. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but not only are they fairly broad brush, they do not refer to mitigation, only adaptation, and yet the Act requires that the policy must in fact refer to mitigation. And the code is framed in a way using the word should, so that it is in effect not binding, it's not obligatory. Recommendation, a review of SPP 5, an urgent review of SPP 5. Let's go to the Planning and Design Code, which, as I said, is the rule book. It's the document, the document contains the criteria to which relevant authorities must have regard when they're making decisions. So the question is, well, how much guidance does the code give on climate change? Now, I've been in trouble for using this as a criterion. That is the third point. I've been in trouble for this, but I'm not resigning from my comment, and it reflects the views of the working group I'm involved with. It's a 4,500-page document with 9 explicit references to climate change. No one is going to convince me that climate change has been seriously taken on board in our planning system if in 4,500 pages you have only 9 references. I'm not convinced. Now, the Minister has responded to this comment from us, saying that you don't determine government commitment and policy by simply doing a search of its documents. Well, I'm sorry, Minister, I disagree. There are very few, there are provisions relating to adaptation, that is responding to climate change. For example, bushfire, flooding, water resources, sea level rise. But what it doesn't do is actually, other than those very few cases, wrap those issues up in a climate change narrative, story. It doesn't do that. You actually have to search through the document, make your decisions, as a relevant authority would have to, make a determination about what actually is a climate change provision, how significant it is. And what we know about the planning system, and it's, we can look at Supreme Court cases on it. I decided not to bore you with a plethora of Supreme Court judgments on a Saturday morning. But the process we have in determining a development application in this state, as elsewhere, is a weighing of the pros and cons involved in a development application in the context of the planning rules. It's a balancing act, the weighing up of these pros and cons, the provisions in the Act, and the relevant authorities are going for a best fit. Very often the outcome we have is by no means ideal, it's optimal. And in that kind of planning system, we have the situation where, as far as climate change is concerned, it can be subordinated to a whole range of other factors which are regarded as more pressing by various sectors, like developers. Now, it won't happen in every case, and in some cases you will get what we could call a climate-sensitive outcome. But in many cases, you will not. And I personally am involved in matters where climate has rated about 1,321 down the list. So we are recommending that there should be urgent review of the code to give clarity and priority to climate change. Now, for a conventional planner, that's probably anathema, red rag to a bull. But our argument is that we must start recognising there are certain priorities which are critical and must be, certain issues which are critical and must be given priority in our planning system in the face of climate change and the known and predicted impacts environmentally, economically, socially, in terms of health. We need to rejig our planning system so it realistically confronts that challenge. So quickly, the conclusions. Yes, the state government is addressing climate change in several respects, but not in the case of the planning system. There is, as I mentioned earlier, no coherent climate change narrative in the planning system. Certainly not in terms of mitigation, but I would argue in terms of adaptation, because the term climate change, even in that context, is rarely used. The Act itself doesn't adequately address climate change. SPP 5 gives insufficient guidance to the framers of the code as to what they should be doing about climate change. And I see we've got a bit of a dislocation of wording here, but basically SPP 5 is underwhelming. And the code itself fails to adequately respond to the climate change challenge. So just to, and again I seem to have fragmented that slide, but never mind, we'll deal with it. What are the implications for the 50-year plan and the work being done by the National Trust? Yes, we need a vision. We need a vision. We badly need a vision for Adelaide. Yes, we need to safeguard those environmental and community values that define Adelaide, define our city, our metropolitan area, in terms of its values today, and that must be held into the future. But this must occur, in my view, in tandem with meeting the climate change challenge. We need a climate-safe city. And my concern is that if we don't meaningfully confront the climate change challenge in our planning processes, we're going to find that those other very important values that the National Trust is very concerned about protecting in relation to our city are going to be subordinated to a future crisis response where heritage buildings, parklands and our hills are going to get lost in the rush to deal with a crisis. So the takeaway message is, yes, we really need a vision for Adelaide. The issues that Norm's raised and others will later in this forum are vitally important. But equally important, at least, is that of climate change, and we need a planning system to be reviewed urgently and changed to reflect the challenges of climate change in our state and city today. Thank you.